Welcome to the Equipping Leaders Podcast Leader Study Series. I'm Natasha, a leader development professional and overall leadership enthusiast.
And I'm Corey, a program manager and an emerging people leader and thus leadership enthusiast.
We're doing a leader study of the TV show Z Nation, deconstructing the leaders, decisions, and team dynamics of the characters on the show to look at how leadership is all around us. And even if we're not in a position of leadership, we can still demonstrate it in our actions, responses, and opportunities.
Z Nation aired from 2014 to 2018, but if you haven't seen it yet, there will be spoilers in these episodes. Today we're talking about the end of season 5, specifically weaknesses in supply chain, exploitation, meeting others where they are, finding the right type of leader you are.
Okay, so we are here. We are basically at the end of season 5 and at the end of this series. And so up until now, we've been talking about the supply chain piece. They're trying to figure out what's in the biz kits. And so now we're at State of Mind, season 5, episode 10. And we're at this big garbage dump. I don't know what they're called now. But yeah, so there's a lot of different things happening with this. So I'll kick it over to you. What were some of the things in this episode that stood out to you?
First of all, we still call them garbage dumps, or refuse stations. So there's a fun fact for you. I'm glad we get to teach each other.
Delightful.
So at this garbage refuge, right? We're getting, like you'd said, towards the end of the supply chain. And we are we're starting to uncover like where this source comes from. You know what I mean? And I think one of the key things that sort of starts from the beginning here is they have these talkers that are I hate to use the term. They're in like this controllable zombie-like state, right? So it's like this subdued, and they're being forced to this labor and everything like that. And they start to notice each other eating, which it looks like eating some of the garbage, and then they get this, all of a sudden they get this clarity. And what it turns out that they're biting into is old batteries, right? And more specifically, they're biting into lithium batteries. So that aside, one thing that I didn't know was that was like a real thing, right? That like lithium helps your mental state and is like something that gets prescribed to people. And I Googled it because I was like, this seems far-fetched. Nope, I'm just uncultured. And so I think that what was interesting there was there was like this sort of overseers, right? You had these folks that were sort of in control of the situation, and they start to all gain this clarity, and they start to take over, right? So there's this like camaraderie in the team, and then they are sort of taken aback now when this zombie part gets flung out of the hole, and there's like this monster. So I just thought it was an interesting setup because we haven't seen that sort of like forced in this little journey that we've been doing through the supply chain. There's never like the ugly back end of it, right? It was like everybody was doing the fight for the good, right? They were baking the biscuits because that's what they did, and the farmers were farming. And now all of a sudden we get to this point where you have people that are being forced into work, and there's apparently a profit involved or something like that, and it just got a little weird. So, and the team starts to uncover that. So that was the first thing that sort of stuck out, was the dark side of the supply chain.
And I think that's also where there's our responsibility as leaders, but also as consumers, to know about supply chain, like where is our food coming from? Where are our products coming from? Who is being exploited along the way? In part, there's the responsibility of an organization to share, to be as transparent as possible. But obviously, if something like this is happening, they're probably not going to be super transparent about that. A thing that I thought was also interesting about this was, you did have essentially the enslaved talkers. And while they were seemingly more complacent, it was really just because they gave them enough to control them.
Yep.
And not enough to actually be functional. And so when they kind of figured that piece out for themselves. So I think that's also really interesting, because sometimes people will limit knowledge or they'll limit access to something in an attempt to keep rank and file, right? To keep them above you, or to, keep a subordinate type situation. When really, and we've learned this from more than a century of research in different types of leadership, absolutely not necessary. And I think over the past maybe 40 years, we're like, oh yeah, actually, that's pretty toxic. That's pretty terrible behavior. So I thought that was interesting too, though. And I like how you brought up that, you get to parts of a supply chain or parts of an organization where, oh wow, these people are all super unhappy, like they're all being limited. And it's something this organization is doing that's actually causing those limitations.
Yeah. And it's something, we were talking about looking back on history with rose colored glasses and everything and just picking the truths you want. Then it becomes this thing. Did they not know anything about the supply chain because they were naive or because they didn't want to know? Right. So because it's their way of life that's causing this issue. So I thought that was, pretty interesting. But so with that though, you have Doc 10K, Warren, and George formulate a plan, right? Breakup is as normal. George and Warren go together, Doc and 10K go together. And they sort of divide and conquer to get an understanding of what's going on here, because they're not aware right now that it's lithium is what's being mined. That's the resource. So one of these things you see of Warren and George, who are working really well together and traditionally work really well together. And you run into this issue where Warren falls through that hole, right? So then she's inside this garbage heap and there's this separation. And what I think is George continues on, but she gets a little shook up in that moment, right? It sort of broke her psyche, and you haven't seen that really yet, where she gets sort of thrown about. And I thought that was sort of interesting too. That emotional connection sort of overpowered the get the mission forward piece.
Well, I think because she's also so recently experienced that loss of Dante, that like these things right on the tail of one another would have shaken her significantly, right? Whereas maybe if they'd been more spaced, still tragic, but yeah, but that's a good point too, where it's like in that moment, how do I keep going? Because before it was Warren who helped her keep going on. So now it's essentially the loss of two things: a friend and that supporter, that leader who is helping to push her forward potentially.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. That's a great point too, because I think as a leader, being a you got to be aware. Are you ready to go back to work yet, so to speak? Right? Are you ready to lead again? Have you recovered fully? So I mean, George doesn't really have much of a choice in this instance. But yeah, no, good point. Sorry, you were gonna say?
No, that was it. You're good.
Well, great then.
Great then. All right. Episode complete. No, so I think it's also interesting. Warren says something that I think is so, it was a great line because it made me think about a lot of other things. So the line is, she said, "Is it just me, or is the apocalypse getting weirder while the years go on?" And I think it was one of those lines that stood out to me, because I hear that often when I talk to different leaders, and I sometimes feel that way myself, where it's just like, is this getting harder? Is this getting weirder? Is this getting like, is this whole journey that we're on? There's no consistency. There's obviously no linear journey that any of us are really doing here. So like, is it just getting weirder? Why does it seem like I'm always back at zero every time a new situation occurs instead of actually making progress? So I don't know. That line just really stood out to me, because I was like, yeah, like things are always getting weird. And as the years go on, it's almost like we don't learn how to adapt to these different things. So you're like, this problem is literally the same problem we had 20 years ago. It's the same problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that now that you say that, I did pick up on that, but I didn't really think about it that much. So that's good, because the one that I picked up on kind of around the same time frame was when Doc and 10K are trying to figure it out. They're like, oh, they're guarding something. It must be super important. And Doc sort of drifts off in like a Doc way, and 10K's like, yo, what's going on? And he's like, look at the garbage, and he's just like, man, someday that's all that's gonna be left of us. And it's like, even in the apocalypse, he's just like, oh, what have we done to the planet? It's like, well, it's, that goose is cooked, my dude, right? The ship has sailed. But yeah, uh that's a really great point about it. I think in leadership, you can, it's like always like sometimes it feels like one step forward, 10 steps back. And that, trying to stay positive throughout all of that, gets difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also as we kind of see this episode unfold, there's this former talker, who is essentially this monster that lives in this garbage heap. And so what I think is so interesting about this is it's very much portrayed as a monster. It's very much, and it is actively fighting anyone and anything it sees in its way. But I think there's also this other element of what it reminded me of is, like, as a society, there are times when a workplace or something makes these people into monsters. There's a certain amount of resilience we can have and all that. I mean, I'm not saying those things don't exist, but I think also, like, I'll just use burnout just as an example. A lot of people are like, oh, prevent burnout, do this self-care, do this self-care. But similar to the canary in a coal mine, I can't continue to fortify that canary. The environment is bad. Like, you got to get the canary out of there in order for it to thrive, or you got to fix that environment. And so there's only so much you can do for that. And I think that there's also, like, when people are like, oh, well, you can do this to prevent burnout. You can't. If you work in a system that supports this busyness, that supports this self-sacrifice, that glorifies all those different things and then works you as hard as they can, you can't prevent burnout. Like, there's nothing that you can then do. The environment is set up that way. So when we're introduced to this character, I think there's also, I love to be a sympathizer with probably all the monsters, but he got that way for a reason. He was probably one of these enslaved talkers who figured out the lithium piece, but then also just kept going deeper into that garbage heap, and nobody was going to come in after them, right? So they probably just assumed they would, again, not feeling like you're seen or heard at work. He disappeared, and people are just like, oh, and they didn't even necessarily put together that it was one of theirs. Now all of a sudden he has figured out something that works for him, and he's a monster, right? But it was ultimately built by the environment he was put in and how he was treated.
Yeah, that such great points. I was thinking it's interesting that he, like you said, he's a monster, yet you reach this point where Warren and George still fighting for him, right? Like, still, like, trying to help. And I think Warren's, it's really powerful where she's like, I see you, right? Like, I see you. I know this isn't who you are. I know this isn't who you want to be. It's who you were made to be. And it's almost like she's apologizing on behalf of everyone else. And I think that was a really powerful move. And I think it's important too, right? And we've talked about it a lot through this whole series about, one of the things that makes Warren such a great leader is acknowledging the things outside of her control, right? She's not trying to change them. She's not trying to do anything. She's acknowledging that they exist, so at least that person can feel seen and heard. And like, we see in this episode that has some great repercussions for them, right? Their safety, at least, and ability to not be talkers.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So then we move into an episode that is a little bit, again, one of those episodic type things where we meet this group of hackers. What were some of your thoughts from that episode?
So they show up. One, the hacker cliche things again, especially just in the tech industry. Let's put all of those aside for the moment. But you see some. I can draw parallels, right? I think. Wait, did we say we don't like to do that? Either way, I work with people who both are in the way of those characters, right? Those hacker characters, and also people who oddly aspire to be like those hacker characters, right? So it's a weird one. This one hit close to home, and what I think is great is able to take a lot away from George, because of the way she handled them and interacted with them, right? They're both being very immature while trying to be elitist, while trying to be mature. It's interesting, but I think George handled it really well because she treated them ultimately how they wanted to be treated, right? Which was, she looked at them as equals or peers, but also didn't give them she gave enough license because she needed something from them, but didn't give them enough license to be disrespectful and held them to account for their actions. And I thought that was, again, I know it's just a TV show, but I thought that was like really really mature and like really like there's a lot to be said for interacting with those people the way she did. I don't know what your thoughts were.
Well, I think whenever there's an in-group or a group who has a very specific identity, or let's say you work in an organization where you have a bunch of groups who have a different culture, you need to understand why that's important to them. And then in order to appeal to them, you need to do things in the most them way possible. And I know some people don't like that because they're like, oh, well, we have to do this thing and we have to do this thing. People just want to be seen. They just want to be loved on. And when you can meet them where they are going to then walk hand in hand with you, right? Metaphorically. And so I think, yeah, I agree that George did like a really great job with that because, again, I think that a lot of people fear like homogeny. And so they're like, we're different. This is who we are. And this is how our culture of this team or this group or this company or whatever is unique. And when you come in and you talk to us like you talk to everybody else, we're not going to like that. Like, we're not going to respond to that out of principle alone, much less anything else. So I think that, yeah, with George, her leadership style in that was essentially understanding that piece of, I acknowledge that you operate differently than other teams, and I'm here for it. So, yeah, I think that was something that probably stood out to me for that piece, where I've definitely seen that in other ways across different organizations.
Well, I also think it's, because Citizen Z was there as well, right? And what I also think is so interesting is he was or could have become one of them, right? Like I think that he has again, it's a TV show, but like he seemed to have higher moral standards and a greater sense outside of self, right, than some of these other hackers do who seem very self-serving. But I think they're both were in the same environments that I think that leadership and that tutelage from Warren, that ability to buy into like a better mission and everything, I think that had a lot to impact like who he was. And it's like, oh wait, you mean like the environment you're in affects the person you are? Duh. But I again, like I said, it's interesting because it's that same sort of folks within an industry. They're all computer people. You have some that are almost intolerable, and then you have another guy who sticks his neck out for you, and you would do for him. And it's, it's all about how that environment where they came from is. So, I just, yeah, that I think is interesting.
Yeah.
So that was the big piece, or a big piece from this, and then for me, and then the other big one was ya boy Murphy, right? Is getting a little bit more involved, and in this case, the talkers, right? They are being blamed for the explosions at the Numerica vote, all this other stuff, and it's not safe, right? There's been this fear mongering that's gone on, and so now the talkers are in danger, and Murphy is hiding some of those talkers, and they come to look for them.
Mhm.
And I think that this is one of the first times, in my opinion, that you see Murphy start to use his authority for the betterment of others, not just himself, because he really, there's a lot of guys there that could easily, make his day and his time rough. And he could just give up all those talkers that he's sheltering and he'd be good to go. You know what I mean? He chooses not to. And I think that's really powerful that he decides to put his foot down for once.
Yeah. Yeah, with him in this episode, and even moving into the next one, not that I'm trying to barrel forward too quickly, but I'm back to being the sympathizer, right? I was from the start.
You never left.
I think that there is something really impactful. And I think Murphy's journey from episode 1 till now really demonstrates this. And that's that when you try to force somebody into something, and you don't know them and you don't know their values, and he was literally forced. And to expect somebody to then be on board with something is wild. It is wild, and it does not work. He could have even pretended his heart out. It would not have worked. So I think that what I love about this piece with Murphy is there's this authenticity in how he wants to show up and be a leader. He's not being forced now. There's this other thing that he has really learned is valuable to him. And he understands who he is as a person and what it is that he wants to do. And he's kind of in those, like, in his strength zones with his like club limbo and all of that. So like, yes, he's also helping people. And then, yeah, in this episode, he's definitely like protecting those talkers, but he had to come to this and figure it out on his own. If Warren had been like, you're going to do a club and have talkers, you know, or whatever, like she couldn't have predicted that. But, you know, if someone else had told him this, very different. He really needed to figure out how it was that he wanted to be in the world. And when people can figure out how they want to be in the world, it makes it easier for them to stand up for social justice issues. It makes it easier for them to stand up for the things that they believe in, thereby taking on that leadership type of role.
Yeah, that is such a great point. And I guess I don't give him enough credit for, you know, that authenticity, right? And becoming authentic. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to say I'm wrong because never give in, but yeah, no, that's a good point. Because but you know, because the other thing that's interesting too is he's now almost all of the original bite mark characters, as this episode continues, start to come together, right? Addie's back, you have Doc, you have 10K, Murphy's there, they're all working together again, you have Warren. So it's really cool because I think that it's like, it's important to, it's about the people you're around, right, that help you grow. And I think that he was around people who saw him at his worst, and I almost think that was better for him to become his best as a leader, you know. And I sometimes try to distance myself, or written off like, those people knew me when I was like 18 and just starting out, so it's like I don't want to deal with them because they remember me as that is. But I think when you have enough trust there, and when people are mature enough, right, to help you grow through that. And so I think he was lucky that he had those people. But yeah, so that was a big, that was a really, really interesting growth moment for Murphy.
I think you also brought up a great point there too, where it's like he could come back together with the rest of Operation Bite Mark as this new person, because they as a team let him grow, but he needed to do that by himself.
Yeah.
Yes, there were experiences that he had with the team, but inherently all of his experiences of the time he was just with the team, he was not growing. It was almost like he was just gathering experiences. And then once he was separated from the team, right? Because I know a few episodes ago, that's when we reconnected with Murphy and he was running the Limbo Club. He figured that piece out on his own. So he needed all this input and then needed that space to figure it out. And I think this goes back to, we've mentioned it in several episodes, this like reflection and this trying things. We can get a bunch of education, we can get a bunch of experiences, we can get all of this input, but it's not until we like actually pause and we actually like remove ourselves from whatever it is that's going on that we can see where the value in that is and why that matters to us. And so I think that was kind of something that Murphy, obviously we didn't talk about it because it's a TV show, but you know, that was, he needed that separation from them. And then when they all came back together, they could also see that it's like, he's not just a person who's trying anymore. He's a person who has in fact evolved.
Yeah. Well, I also, you know, that's such a good point too, because also if I'm like, I work with you, right? You're my boss. You do something, I don't know. You give everyone a handshake at the end of the day. It's a cool leadership trait. Kind of weird if I copycat you in the moment, right? It looks a little weird. So maybe I think it's a great idea. I should probably shake everybody's hand at the end of the day. But maybe if I try that my own, maybe I find out I'm a hugger. Right? I'm not. Spoiler alert, right? But you know, maybe I find out like I'm a hugger and that's my thing. But, you know, get that chance to collect. That's a fantastic point. Right? Gather those skills and then try them out in the wild. You know, that's such a good point. Such a good point.
And as we move into that next episode, once again, Murphy, so he has his club, Limbo. It's kind of a little bit of a secret underground type club. But now he's actively leading and walking with the talkers to the election to help ensure that they get an opportunity to vote. And so once again, it was like, he wasn't a leader. He didn't want to be seen. And then he kind of wanted to be seen like in this very glorified way when he was the Murphy for a time and blue. And then now he's at a place where he doesn't feel the need to be the Messiah. He is literally walking right next to the people that he's leading. And I think that's also that maturity that comes from true leadership, where Dave Stachowiak on his podcast, Coaching for Leaders, he always says, leadership isn't about you, but it starts with you. And so I think that Murphy really like encompassed that in those moments of like, yep. So he needed to do all this work, all this internal work, and also realize that like, these are the things that are important and valuable to me. Now let me help move these people to where they want to be and where I want us all to be as well.
Yeah. And I think because his intentions were good, he became what he wanted to be anyway, right? Like you know, and that's it's neat. Also, social conditioning. You said he's blue, and in my head I just went dabba dee dabba die, dabba dee dabba die. And I don't know how I feel about that, but I think so. With that, I think the other thing too, so Sunmay, who's been in the background, she's been working on this vaccine thing. She finally finds something that is, you know, bordering on successful. She's having far more success with those trials, and you know, she's been off on the wayside a little bit, but has been still enabling the team in that mission. And you know, I think it was a couple or a few episodes ago where we'd sort of talked about how she fit in with the group, right? She came in. She had that goal. Her goal never shifted. She just found people that she sort of could align to. And I think that obviously she bought in a little bit. I think she went along, right? Because she believed in what Bitemark was trying to do more so than just these folks enable me to do what I want to do. And I think that her drive and determination to continue, but also still help. And what that ultimately ends up meaning for her is again, you get these sort of, it's the end of the series and we're coming to the last few episodes, so things get a little bit more emotional and people can make more ultimate sacrifices for the sake of their character and closing out the story. But I think that always having the goal, it was clear cut and defined, and realizing, hey, Murphy can normally interpret information once things are figured out. I think that was we're starting to get to that point, and I think that's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
So what's my other big thing from this one? George's so as we walk through here too, George's loyalty, right? So she's getting put through the ringer, and she's they want information from her. They're kind of being a little bit aggressive with her, and she's really prepared. She really believes in the goal and that mission. And again, I know we talked earlier or last episode or whatever, sort of about don't sort of sacrifice yourself for the group, but I mean, she's in a situation where it's like her only option. So I think that's, again, she could make it easier on herself. She's choosing to take the harder path, as it were, for the betterment of the group.
Mm-hmm. I think there are some people who that is naturally who they are. I don't think that makes them any better or worse than anybody else. But there are some people who are just, I don't mean this in a negative way. It's going to sound that way. They're designed to be the martyr, right?
Wow. No, I'm sorry.
So, I mean, and they do move things forward in doing that. So yeah, so I think, yeah, her character is just such an interesting one because she's not doing anything out of feeling forced necessarily. Like, she believes in this thing bad enough and strongly enough to literally sacrifice everything for it. And I think that most people just don't feel that way. They're just forced into a position of desperation, of needing a job or needing this thing or needing to feel seen or feel like they're influencing something in some way. When with a character like George, she believes this to her core. And so that's
Well, it's
different.
also when they're sort of interrogating her and stuff, right? They're like, where are where are all the talkers? And she throws that back at him. I don't know. You're the one who rounded them all up. You tell me, right? So it's like, I think that that's cool. Like that she will not let go of that, right? Because this is now the new leadership of the organization right now, right? Most of the people have agreed that, oh yeah, the talkers are bad, and we're going there. She's sticking around saying talkers aren't bad, right? Like you're a monster. I'm gonna call you out on this, even if it means, my life or my job, as it were. She's staying true to that. And I think you need people like that in an organization. So that was it's a big piece.
Yeah. And then we're now at the end, the last episode. And as different things are unfolding, we have this election, we have leadership roles essentially kind of being shuffled as we're watching this. And the biggest thought I had, the only thing I wrote down, even though there were a lot of great takeaways, was where you think you're going is not necessarily where you're going to end up. And I didn't put that to be provocative and philosophical, but I was just thinking, like, if we look back at episode 1, Warren is trying to get Murphy to California. Murphy is trying to avoid getting to California. There's just a lot of these different things, but like who every single one of these characters were at the very start, I think that they all had really incredible character arcs where we got to see them at their worst, and then we got to see them at their best. And we got to see a lot of them really figure out where they stood as members of a team and as members and as leaders. So I think that sometimes we it's human nature that we're like, I have these goals and I'm trying to get to this thing. And, maybe it's like, oh, I want to be an executive. And along the way, you're like, but as I move up, I realize I have to give up these other things, right? So if I take Murphy, for example, when he was like seen as like this messiah person, he didn't realize how limiting that truly was for him in a billion ways, right? So then to realize like, that's not what I want. This is the type of leader I want to be. And so I think that like a lot of the things that whether we're conditioned when we're young to think that this is what leadership is, or this is what success is, that along the way, just being open to and letting people and experiences change you is really valuable, because you could really find yourself, cheesy thing to say, but like living your best life, but truly because you let yourself be open to those different things.
Yeah. Well, similarly with Estes, right? My big thing with that is like, lies can get you far, but they can't finish, right? Like you can't finish on lies. And I think with Estes, all of his and we've seen this play out in leadership situations time and time again at every level. But it's like you can lie and you can fearmonger and you can do some stuff, and people are going to buy in. But eventually, that truth is going to come out, and your chickens are going to come to roost. And I think that sometimes it doesn't have to be as big or as dark as what Estes did. I think sometimes as a leader, you're just it's an easy path, right? To maybe stretch the truth, or make up the generic, well, the CEO said we have to do this. The CEO didn't say that. It's going to probably come out that the CEO didn't say to do that. And are you going to get fired over that? Probably not. But do you know what? That team's never going to listen to a thing you say ever again, right? Every pressing, sky is falling situation, they're going to tell you to pound sand. And I think it's a mistake a lot of people, I think I've made it too, where it's like, need something done, just be like, hey, the boss said we got to get this done, so let's do it, because I didn't want to be the bad guy, right? Nope. It needs to be done. There's nothing bad about that. That's what we're here for. So
Yeah.
yeah, that was kind of one of the big ones for me that stuck out.
Yeah, but yeah, overall, it's even Estes, who we just met recently, comparatively to all the other characters, it was even interesting to see that arc where you're like, oh, is this like a do-gooder, right?
Yeah.
But it's just maybe a little more formal about it. No, monster, total monster. But you're right. I think also though, there are things that people can get away with in society because we can't point to exactly why that's a problem or why that's wrong or why it's damaging, even though we know that it is.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Again, he was a Zona guy too, and it's funny to me as well, where it's like Zona was doomed to fail because the people that were there, he existed there. So what he did to Numerica, he would have done to Zona had he been given the same amount of time. So it's like bad people just make bad organizations. You can't, and good people make good organizations, you know? So it really does come down to being that simple, you know? So,
Yeah.
yeah, that was a big one for me. My other, I guess, do you have anything else from the episode?
Mm.
Yeah, my only other thing is at the very end, the very end, George gets sort of elected as president or whatever, a new president. And she goes to give a speech about, what this is going to be. And I think that one of the things that she highlights in there is the friends that taught me along the way. And I think that is sort of the key thing here, was none of those folks would still be around this late in the zombie apocalypse had it not been for other people helping them. So I think that was sort of like a big takeaway for me. I mean, there's some generic glittering kumbaya and we're going to get through this, but I think just that acknowledgement, right? That self-awareness to acknowledge I am not here because of me. I'm here because of the people with me. And I that was pretty big.
Yeah, 100%. We can't do anything by ourselves. It's funny. I was listening to this podcast the other day where Dr. Henry Cloud, who he does a lot of research on trust and boundaries. And he said, he met someone who said that they don't trust anybody. And he said, but you rode the elevator up to get to this meeting. And so you trusted that elevator wasn't going to crash. Like, you do have trust in other people. So I think that it's like, we don't realize that like almost everything we do throughout the day is made possible, is made positive by other people, even if we don't necessarily think about or see those faces behind it. So even though with George, I know in this episode, you're talking about like we could literally see Warren, who helped her like on day one and all of that. But I think also there's, nobody can do anything really on their own. Not true.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. No, this was fun. And being open to change. Let's jump in.